Before I pass the microphone to Alan, I would like to read just a brief summary of his biography. As many of you know, Mr. Stoga is a strategist with extensive experience in geopolitics, government, banking, communications, and consulting. Today, he serves as Senior Advisor at Kissinger Associates and is the President of Zemi Communications, a firm advising international companies on issues occurring in the United States. He is also the Executive Chairman of the Thalberg Foundation in Sweden, Chairman of the Tinker Foundation, Vice Chairman of the Board of the America Society, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is an economist by training and is a frequent lecturer and writer on international, Latin American, and U.S. politics and economics. Alan, welcome. And on behalf of all of us in COMEXI, we thank you very much for being here with us today. The floor is all yours, Alan.
Thank you, Mariana. The one thing you forgot to say is that I also am a past associate of COMEXI.
It is true.
So it's an organization that I know well and that I think has played an important role in the bilateral, at least, conversation over the last decades since it was founded. As you said, Mariana, what I'd like to do is first talk a little bit about how I see the Trump administration having landed and what I think about their character, what we might expect by way of background to our conversation. And the point of departure for that has to be recognition that we in the United States have literally never seen anything like this. This is the first time in our history that we elected someone as president who has absolutely zero background in either politics or in the military. The closest analogy the historians are suggesting is Andrew Jackson from 1829, although by the time he was elected our first populist president, he'd already run and lost once, he fought a war or two, he had experience on at least the national stage. The other comparison, of course, is Ronald Reagan in the 80s. And there's a lot of effort, partly because of the tax-cutting stuff, to say, this feels a bit like Reagan. I think that's a mistake as well. Reagan, of course, has been governor of California for a couple terms. He brought with him a team, an experienced team from government. Donald Trump is, for better and for worse, unique. And that, I think, is the first point. Many, many people, including many of my friends in Mexico, are assuming because of that, he will therefore fail. Because he doesn't know anything about the job, therefore, and indeed many of his cabinet, about their jobs, therefore they will fail. I think that's an enormous, it may prove to be true, but it's an enormous mistake starting. What do we know about the government as it's emerging? I think the most important point is you need to think of both Donald Trump, but also his administration, as fundamentally a mercantilist government. It feels like Britain of the 18th or 19th century. It's not a 20th or 21st century kind of government, at least in my judgment. They are certainly not ideological. Indeed, they're not particularly Republican. If anything, there is and I'll talk about it in a minute, a feud. Slides are moving around by themselves now. If anything, there's a potential, almost fatal feud, potentially fatal feud between the Republican Party and Donald Trump, and I'll come back to that. They are amateurs. They are proud amateurs. This is a DIY government, do it yourself. He was elected to challenge and to change the status quo, and that's what he's going to do. He may fail in the process, but he is going to blow up anything that looks like the status quo just because it is the status quo. Partly as a result of all that, there are fundamental contradictions inside the cabinet. If you look at it as a normal cabinet, look at the economic team, for example. You've got two diametrically opposed groups. One are the protectionists, the Secretary of Commerce, the Special Trade Representative, the Trade Advisor in the White House. The other are the global capitalists, the Secretary of Treasury, the head of the National Economic Council, people who have made their fortunes in the capital markets, who believe in open markets, not necessarily trade guys, but they certainly look at the world fundamentally different than the trade guys do. Same thing on the national security side. We've got at least three groups. We've got some neocons. We have generals who look at things as military, career military men. And we have the mercantilists. Secretary of State arguably is one of those. In terms of philosophy, this is good old-fashioned republicanism. Cut taxes, cut regulations, but interestingly, strong net exports create jobs, which is the mercantilist part of the equation. They're not Republicans in the sense of free trade is great. The mantra for years that's got passed in part. They are mercantilists. They believe in advantage first to the United States. In terms of the president himself, the thing that's most noticeable about Donald Trump is that he is completely comfortable in his own skin. This is someone who knows who he is. He is a completely formed person, doesn't seem to have many doubts, doesn't start the day wondering what's going to happen. He starts the day wondering what he's going to accomplish and how he's going to move the world. Again, as I said, for better or worse, I don't think we've ever seen anything like that in the presidency. I want to take a very, very, very quick detour through a couple economic points because that's how Trump thinks. There is a mistake being made at the moment saying, oh, this is just like Reagan, we're going to have big tax cuts and hence the markets will boom. The answer to that is maybe. I'm not a very good stock picker. But what I do know is that the world today is fundamentally different in economic terms than it was in the 80s. We have very low. The United States is a highly indebted nation at every sectoral level. We have a fully valued stock market. We have full employment. We live in a world of rising protection. It really is a different stage on which Donald Trump and his policies will perform than it was with Ronald Reagan. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, we are in uncharted waters. By any way you look at the data, the blue line is debt to GDP, the red is growth. The U.S. economy has been slowing and on a slowing trajectory for some time, and we have been borrowing like there is no tomorrow. Now, of course, with very low interest rates the last couple of years, that made a lot of sense, but we have become a highly indebted nation and a very slow-growing nation. That is part of the reason he's president. But this is really why he's president. If you look at hourly compensation, and there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but American workers essentially haven't had much of a wage increase for literally decades. The capital markets, however, net productivity is one of the ways to look at this. The return to capital has been spectacular. Your computer doesn't like this chart. Has been spectacular. Wall Street's done well. Main Street has done horribly. And indeed, well, someone keeps on turning the slides all the way back. And indeed, which I'm going to give up on in a minute, but I want to show you one or two more pictures. Indeed, the standard of living of Americans has been sustained by debt. The reason Americans aren't more depressed is that they have been able to use their credit cards and their revolvers and the banks to indeed sustain a standard of living which has been very much eroded at the edges. And it's those people that are barely making paycheck to paycheck, that can barely sustain their standard of living, that are elected him president. So what's he going to do? What is he doing? Because he's already, this is the second business day of the administration. He is going to continue to challenge the status quo. He will tweet, he will attack NATO, he will take phone calls from Taiwan, he will look for very cheap wins, trying to persuade, as he did yesterday at breakfast and again today, trying to persuade businessmen, businesswomen, that they need to rearrange their investment plans, rearrange their hiring plans. He intends to, a la Teddy Roosevelt, carry a very big stick and to whack people aside the head with it, and he's going to do it every day. He needs to get his administration confirmed. They're behind. We only have 3 cabinet secretaries, 2 cabinet secretaries, the head of the CIA at the moment. That is a priority. It's a political priority. It's a process that has to get done. He has promised that he will nominate a Supreme Court judge. That is going to be enormously controversial. It will bring the kinds of people that were in the streets around the world last Saturday back into the streets, because the odds that this is a conservative white male are pretty high. We'll see, shouldn't prejudge. But nonetheless, we certainly don't expect a liberal who's going to endorse abortion and other liberal causes. He will work with the Congress, and I'll come back to the politics of this in a second, on radical tax reform. This is almost certainly one of the highest priorities of the Republicans in Washington, that is to say in the Senate and the House. It coincides with something the president would like to do. It is going to suck most of the political energy out of Washington. It is likely to leave very little space to do much else. And from that point of view, it's important. It's extremely important as you think about what's he going to do with Mexico. Obviously, he is already undoing as much as he can of President Obama's legacy. You see it in appointments, you see it in deregulation, you see it in the assault on health care. Obviously, TPP unsigned yesterday. In terms of foreign policy, Theresa May is in town. She will be the first official meeting. We'll talk about President Peña Nieto in a moment. The big one, of course, is going to be the Putin meeting. If you're thinking about strategy from the point of view of the White House, having an early summit with the Russians is the sort of thing that all of the foreign policy establishment is likely to tell you you can't do, which is precisely the reason why you might think Donald Trump as president will say, sure, let's do it. And of course, he's talking about energy exploration in the United States, new infrastructure, et cetera. We know, they've said yesterday again, that NAFTA will be the first trade negotiation, but the issue isn't when it starts, the issue is when might it end. Which brings us to the Mexican agenda. Oh, tax reform first, I'm sorry. The proposal that is working its way through the congressional committees is for a truly radical change in our corporate tax structure. Many insist it can't be done. It's way too complicated in its politics, not in its design. It's fairly simple in its design. It's essentially a fixed tax on net domestic cash flow generated. That may sound confusing, but it essentially means you don't pay taxes if you export, and you don't get a credit if you import, and you simply pay on cash that you generate in the United States at a fixed rate of something like 15 or 20%. The fact that it's simple means that it would have profound winners and losers, new winners and losers from the existing very, very complex system. And it would fundamentally rearrange domestic industry, domestic corporate structure, as well as our foreign relations. Think if you are a Mexican exporter, if you are if you're a company that works on both sides of the border, but suddenly is being told, oh, your imports are not a deductible expense from your corporate tax base in the United States, you've got a problem. You will presumably have to change your pricing structure or find new sources for those imports. It has a huge potential impact on Mexico because, of course, Mexico is the United States' largest trading partner. Now, what about Mexico? We know that there will be, and it was confirmed again yesterday, there will eventually be formal notice to renegotiate. That's already a fait accompli because both President Peña and Prime Minister Trudeau have said, hey, we want to renegotiate. They see a train when it's coming at them. The renegotiation, however, is based on from our point of view, would be based on a fundamentally different assessment, different basis than the original negotiation 25 years ago. 2 decades ago, we were trying to create something new together that would benefit everyone. The renegotiation from the point of view of the incoming administration is exactly not that. It is about getting a better deal for the United States, whom they perceive to be disadvantaged by NAFTA as it now exists. not as much on the tariff side as on the non-tariff side and on the side of excluded sectors. Obviously, the TPP commitments that Mexico already made will be the point of departure. From a negotiating point of view, you already know what Mexico is willing to give. You already know what Mexico reserved, so you have that defined. The problem, of course, is that from the U.S. point of view, that's a trade negotiation. President Pena yesterday, I think, correctly asked for something much broader than that. From Mexico's point of view, obviously, you would like this to be a broad, all-encompassing negotiation, including border security, including the wall, including immigration, including deportations, et cetera, et cetera. Not at all clear that the incoming administration sees it that way. In fact, my gut instinct tells me they don't. The trade guys see it as a trade thing. The national security guys see it as an border thing. And we'll see whether or not they are capable of responding to the kind of approach that was suggested yesterday, and presumably that will be discussed on January 31st. All of that said, you got to remember that the president still has his cell phone. He will continue to use that cell phone to tweet. So individual companies are going to be assaulted. Individual acts will be highlighted, good, bad, and ugly. The president is not going to suddenly become someone other than he is, and that will certainly apply to this negotiation. As this negotiation unfolds over the next months, and I suspect years, it's not going to be just conducted inside closed rooms. It's rather going to be conducted a la tweet. Which takes us to politics. Trump will govern as an outsider. Everything we know about him is that he will not suddenly become a Washingtonian. He literally and his family literally are not necessarily moving there. This is a president who will govern as an outsider. He does have a love-hate relationship with the Republican leadership. For the moment, they want to see him succeed only because they need to succeed. They need to show that they can govern, and that's about passing tax reform. It's about undoing health care. It's about regulation. The president has already threatened Congress. That speech he gave, his inaugural speech, was as much a threat to the Congress as to anyone, as it was to Mexico. He said, we, the people, me and my people that elected me, are going to govern. And if you don't like it, you're going to have to deal with them. And that is clearly, for better and for worse, how he sees the world. Trump's potential opposition politically is not the Democrats. They are awful in opposition. They are completely riven at the moment. As a party, the Republicans literally are stronger than they've been since Reconstruction in the 1880s. They control more than 2/3 of all state legislatures, more than half of all governorships, as well as obviously the presidency, the House, and the Senate. Politics in the United States for at least the next 2 years is going to be an internal Republican fight, with one possible exception. And that, of course, is the streets. What we saw on Saturday was the willingness of Hillary Clinton's supporters in the main, and I suspect there were very few Trump supporters out there in the women's marches, willing to go to the street and say, we're going to stay active. We'll see if that happens, and we'll see if we start having a battle for the streets between those who voted for Hillary and don't like what they see going on, and those who voted for the president, the now president, and presumably are getting what they asked for. One final comment, because you said 20 minutes, and it is. I think there are, as you think about what this administration may be, and most of it is still a blank slate, there are three potential mistakes that you can make. First, many are assuming, and I am sure they are wrong, that Washington will change him, that the awe and majesty of that Oval Office, of the power that comes with that office, will somehow reshape him into something other than he has been. I would be very surprised if that happens. Secondly, the assumption that what you think of as the checks and balances will in fact check and balance. Again, that would surprise me. We, the United States, have created a very powerful office over the last 40 years. The presidency has too few, in my judgment, checks and balances. Don't expect them suddenly to reappear. And finally, the third assumption that people are making, and I think is wrong, is that he's going to leave governing to his cabinet and to the staff. Yep, he wants to be the chairman, but this is a chairman who on some days will go down and check if the boiler's working. On other days, will just chair the board meeting. He's going to be a very activist, interventionist, dynamic, for better or for worse, president. And I guess all of that adds up to I don't think it's the end of the world. I think Spiegel is wrong. But it is the end, Mariana, as you said at the start, it is certainly the end of an era and start of something new. Why don't I stop there and see how entirely your audience disagrees with me?
Alan, thank you very much. I really appreciate your comments. They're really interesting and maybe a little bit scary as well. I will now open, before I start any questions, I will now open the floor to our viewers. And we have started to receive some questions, so I will just read them, Alan, directly to you, okay? The first one is, Trump has shown he's willing to sacrifice certain sectors' interests, such as automotives, in the name of America First. Do you think it is likely he would implement similar trade policies that would be detrimental to the U.S. energy companies operating or selling in Mexico?
Two-part answer. Remember that the Secretary of State is an energy guy. Soon-to-be Secretary Tillerson has spent his entire career at Exxon. He sees the world through glasses that are Texas energy glasses. And he'll have a very powerful impact on policy as it unfolds. The question with regard to energy, I think it is in fact one of those spaces where there's enormous potential for U.S. companies, and indeed for Mexican companies, but for U.S. companies, for an American First administration to benefit. So unlike the auto industry, which has a huge invested position in Mexico, by definition, the U.S. energy sector does not. The extent to which the openings in hydrocarbons and electricity, in renewables continue over the next years in Mexico, I think that is precisely one of the spaces where a Trump administration would see the U.S. Having an advantage, and indeed would be looking for, if not preference, and I'm not sure they are, but certainly for access. So I don't think that it's likely to be a place where he would disadvantage American companies. Quite the opposite. It's a space where he'd be looking for advantages for American companies, both because it's relatively virgin territory by definition, but also because of the sort of mercantilist twist, and in particular the worldview of the incoming Secretary of State. Mariana, you're off mic.
We have another question, Alan. What about the private sector as the main check and balance to Trump from inside and outside the government?
The private sector, near as we can tell at the moment, U.S. private sector at least, is terrified of Donald Trump. They're terrified because they've never had to cope with a president who's willing to, by name, call them out and demand things. What Trump seems to be trying to do, and he met this morning at breakfast with the auto industry. Yesterday, he had breakfast with a handful of U.S. corporate leaders. He wants a relationship with them for sure, and he's also with union leaders. But he is also willing to push them to do what he wants, and what he wants, he would argue, is what's best for the country. They are globalists, he is not. His worldview is an America First, as he keeps on saying. It really is a throwback kind of worldview, and he intends to reshape the American economy, not just because he can, but because he thinks it would be for the benefit of the country. I give him the benefit of the doubt that he genuinely believes that. But he is confronting people who have been working at a global basis for many years, fundamentally different assumptions about how the world works, fundamentally different drivers, and he intends to govern his way and bend them to his will. So sure, they will be a check, if not a balance, and indeed many of them wrote checks, and that's a different kind of check. But there's a second point, which is Trump is not the only economic nationalist that is in office in the industrial world. I think we have to recognize that Trump, at least in my judgment, is a symptom, not a driver of something much larger going on. And that is a shift away from globalization. It is characteristic of almost every country in Europe at the moment, certainly characteristic of the United States, but true in a lot of other countries as well. You see it in the global trade numbers, you see it in the banking numbers, you see it in the incidence of trade actions. That global model that we all assumed was the end of history may well be passing, and what Donald Trump is doing is accelerating the pace of its passage, not initiating its passage.
Thank you, Alan. Now I have a question that is a little bit more sort of big picture. As you mentioned in your presentation, we woke up last Friday with a completely new global scenario. US voters said they no longer trust nor the institutions nor their leaders. They want the United States to move in a completely different direction. And by picking Trump, they chose a United States with closed borders, less trade, and more focused on internal issues. Trump is probably the bomb they chose to explode the current order. If that is the case, do you think it will affect the long-standing US alliances with other liberal democracies around the world?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is don't put so much emphasis on Trump as a driver of this new world. Edelman, the public relations firm, has been doing for a number of years a global survey of trust and aspects around trust. They recently published their 2017 Trust Barometer. They interviewed 32,000 people around the world in 20 years. 53% of the answers to their polls said that the system, as they defined it, is failing. Another 32% said, we're not sure, the system might be failing. Of the countries that said the system is failing, overwhelmingly, they were the liberal democracies. Overwhelmingly, and I'm looking at the numbers, France, Italy, Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, Germany, UK, Australia, Ireland, the United States, Netherlands, all countries that the respondents think the existing system is failing them. If anything, I would argue Trump's a lagged indicator, not a leading indicator of something that's going on. That's the first point. The second point is absolutely, if I'm right that Trump is more mercantilist than he is a globalist. Remember Lord Palmerston, countries have interests, not alliances. Remember, for that matter, George Washington. I very much see a challenge, not just from Trump, but from something that's in the atmosphere, something that's in the air, to the existing structure of alliances that were built after 1948. Think about Asia. When we, the United States, built an alliance with then recently defeated Japan and made them one of our core allies, China was both part of the reason for that, but somewhat of an afterthought in terms of global power. Today, obviously, China is anything but an afterthought in global power. Would the United States go to war? We have four treaty allies that you might imagine: Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Thailand. Are we prepared to go to war for those countries if China pushes them? That's a question that may get answered in the next years. Are we prepared to go to war over Estonia, over the Baltics? As an internationalist, I would argue absolutely those alliances are in fact the core backbone of how this system has worked. But clearly those questions are going to be asked, maybe answered differently in the next years. So yes, I think we are in a process, Trump will accelerate it, of rethinking a lot of the sinews, the tendons of this structure that has worked pretty well for 70 years, but is clearly not working as well as it has in the past.
I'm going to read you another question, Alan. The President of the United States has wide powers to take unilateral action regarding trade and tariffs, as we saw yesterday. Although it is true that NAFTA is more than 20 years old and needs refreshing, it is also true that it has been beneficial to the United States. For example, Mexico was the United States' second export market in last year. Exports from the United States to Mexico doubled in the past 10 years and have quintupled since NAFTA. To what extent is the U.S. willing to sacrifice its export markets by imposing these protectionist measures we talked about?
I'm not sure which protectionist measures we've talked about, because again, what the Trump people are talking about, their essential analysis of NAFTA in particular, is not that the statistics you just quoted are bad, not that there hasn't been economic value created, although they would argue violently that there's been a net job loss, and it depends how you do the numbers. But rather that NAFTA, and in fact, the president has repeatedly said, I want to renegotiate this. Wilbur Ross, incoming Secretary of Commerce, at his hearing said, we want to renegotiate this. Yesterday, the president's spokesman in his first press conference, full press conference, said, we're going to renegotiate. If we can't negotiate a better deal, yes, then we'll blow it up. And I'm sure they don't think that Mexican exporters are going to walk away from the U.S. market as a result of that. What they're, and remember, this is a negotiation. So what they want, what we know what they want. They want an adjustment on the VAT. They want changes in rules of origin. They want a different dispute settlement. They want non-tariff barriers reduced. They want better access in the energy sector. They want better access in the digital sales sector. Indeed, they want a lot of what Mexico has already was willing to give up in TPP. I genuinely think that the NAFTA negotiation is the easiest part of this. The question isn't, can you modernize NAFTA, which desperately needs modernization, and everybody agrees with that. And we wouldn't be having this conversation if 4, 8, 10 years ago, in fact, the countries had agreed to that renegotiation. We'd be having a different conversation. The problem, in my judgment, in North America is not going to be the trade side of the equation. I think that's fixable. I think that's negotiable. I think the question is the larger context, and can we imagine a solution which works for everybody, that is about border security, which clearly is one of the core principles of Trumpism, which is about a different migration/immigration arrangement than the one that we have today. Those issues, which also have not been addressed I would argue, in an adult fashion, need to be addressed. Are we going to mix, as President Pena has indeed asked, these issues? And if so, the risk of blowing up the trade side strikes me as higher rather than lower. I'm not saying that's the wrong approach. It's a much higher risk approach, in my judgment. Don't interpret Trump as not wanting to export. These guys believe in exports. They actually believe too much in exports as the driver of growth and job creation. In economic terms, they don't understand the rest of the current account. They don't understand services flows. They're focused on goods production. And they are laser focused on the bilateral trade deficit. If you were to ask someone like Peter Navarro in the White House, how will he know if he's been successful 4 years from now vis-a-vis Mexico? I suspect his answer would be if the trade deficit is much lower than it is today. There's only two ways to get it lower. One is to increase exports and one is to reduce imports. And that's what Navarro and all of his writings and his analysis and his speaking is focused on like a laser. How do you get that done is the challenge. Is it doable is the challenge. Last point, they aren't globalists. They're not looking at the overall intersection between the United States and the global economy. They really are mercantilists. They're looking at country by country, market by market. How do we get a better deal with the UK? So Theresa May is coming over, in fact, to lay the basis for a bilateral US-UK negotiation on the trade side, which legally they can't even do yet, but apparently they're going to try. That isn't anti-trade. They're not anti-trade. They're anti-trade deficit, which is a weird animal. We haven't seen one for a long time like that. You've disappeared. Can't hear you.
Although it is true that the Republicans have a majority in both houses, it is also true that not all Republicans are Trumpians. To what extent are the traditional Republicans willing to support a protectionist agenda, or Trump's agenda rather, or will they side with the Democrats that are traditionally biased against free trade? So how do you think the Republican Congress is going to play in all of this scenario?
You got to start with the reality that the Congress is not going to be asked to do anything on trade for a long time. Yeah. So those traditional Republicans who support and have been the backbone of our free trading policies for years aren't going to have to make a choice for a long time. The agenda in the Congress today and for the next months is going to be taxes. Wait, back up. It's going to be first the cabinet, sub-cabinet, then the Supreme Court. It's going to be taxes, certainly corporate tax, probably individual tax. It's going to be deregulation. It is not trade. Trade is not an issue in the Congress. The best, you can't even imagine a trade deal going to the Congress in 2017. I'd be stunned if it makes it there before the end of 2018. And I will point out, of course, that 2018 is an election year. Nobody in their right mind brings a trade deal. We saw it didn't work so well last year to the Congress in a trade deal. So I can't imagine congressional legislation on trade, a renegotiated NAFTA, for example, or a UK deal or a whatever deal, anytime in the near future. So they're not going to have that problem. They'll have opportunities to complain, to question. But even if you go, and I would advise you to go back and Google Wilbur Ross's hearings. Wilbur Ross is the incoming Secretary of Commerce. He is very protectionist in the sense that we've been talking it today. I did hear a lot of criticism, listen to his hearings from the Republicans about his views on trade. Quite the contrary. So the real point is that this issue is from a congressional political point of view, is moot. The issue is a different one. Will the Republicans support radical tax reform? Will they support some very radical nominees? Who will break ranks first? You are certainly right, and it's the Senate, not the House, that you worry about. The Republicans have a 2-seat majority in the Senate. It was interesting to watch Mr. Tillerson's hearings. 3 Republicans came out very critical of Tillerson from the first and second days of hearings. And yesterday, all 3 got in line and said they will, in fact, support him. I think you're going to see an awful lot of Republican unity for at least a while. This is a marriage of convenience. It's a marriage that I suspect will fray, but I don't think it frays anytime soon. And it certainly won't fray over trade, because nobody's going to ask him to do anything on trade for a long time.
Alan, if you agree, I know we said 20-minute questions, but I still have a few more questions. If you agree, I will ask you just 2 more, and then we we will close this webinar, okay?
Your choice.
Is it too early to say that Mr. Trump will be a 4-year president if the street protests ramp up enough, or if there is some conflict of interest? Is there any chance that Democrats will try to impeach him?
Democrats can't impeach, they have minorities.
Right.
I don't think the issue, I think it's a couple different issues. One, yes, it is way too early to say what's going to happen in 2020. We are in no man's land. We have absolutely no idea how we've never seen anything like this. We have no idea how it's going to work. First point. Second point, the street protests on Saturday, the supposed Million Women March, et cetera, if you're a betting man, I'd be willing at least to bet that most of the people that were in the streets were Hillary Clinton voters or non-voters. Remember that a lot of people under 30, particularly those under 24, didn't vote. They never vote. They didn't vote for Obama. They didn't vote for Clinton. They didn't vote back in the 60s. Young people in the United States, unfortunately, don't vote. They will go out and protest and march and yell, but they don't vote. I'd be willing to bet that there was no one in that march the other day that voted for Trump. So you've seen part of Hillary's supporters come out to the streets and say, boy, we really regret this outcome. The issue is, will that continue? Will there be competing marches? Will we get into, so does Trump try to put his people in the streets? Do you get confrontations? Do we get something that looks like the 70s or the 60s going on? I think that's unlikely, but unknowable. The third point is the one I mentioned in passing, impeachment. Remember, you need a majority to impeach. The Republicans want him to succeed, at least for the moment. Last point, conflict of interest. I don't think, and I'm not a lawyer, but the president, in fact, is technically exempt from the conflict of interest laws. He is subject only to the Constitution, something called the Emoluments Clause, and that has certain prohibitions. There's a lawsuit filed yesterday arguing the fact that foreigners stay at his hotels by definition means he has a conflict. That's sort of crazy. I suspect that lawsuit fails. I think we're going to have, I don't think that, I would be very surprised if the conflict of interests around Mr. Trump actually matter. I would worry more about other parts of his government, and we'll see how those work out. But no, he's there for 4 years. You've got to assume that. Whether a 74-year-old will be in shape to run for re-election is a more interesting question. But he's already announced his slogan for 2020, so he's telling us he plans to run for re-election.
And the last question, Alan, it is more about Mexico. In the context of a United States that is not trading with Mexico in the same terms, with a vision of a North America that is no longer the North American region that we saw. If Mexico becomes destabilized and insecure, I mean, wouldn't that be a factor that might affect the United States as well?
Well, absolutely, but I challenge the premise. If Mexico becomes unstable, it's not because of Donald Trump. It would be because of corruption, because of the failure of the economy to grow, because of the challenges that aren't being met in the educational sector. I think that there are more than enough issues floating around Mexico for Mexicans to worry about, in addition to which the lack of vision, not just from the United States, but arguably from Mexico. I've not seen the North American leadership articulate much of a North American vision, for about 25 years. That was a terrific effort 25 years ago. There really was a unique moment in our three countries, and we've been living off the past. Past glories are interesting, but old football players don't get to play again, right? So we have failed collectively to renew that vision. I think it's a mistake to blame it on Trump for saying the emperor is a little bit underclothed here. So I think there's a lot of issues that will affect whether or not, how stable Mexico is. As a friend of Mexico, I certainly want Mexico to succeed and expect that Mexicans will in fact make Mexico succeed, regardless of who's in the office of the president. But I know that that issue is floating around, that doesn't Trump understand he's going to destabilize Mexico? And frankly, I reject the premise that Trump is the scariest force out there in terms of Mexican prosperity and security.
Alan, unfortunately, we have arrived to the end of our time and the end of this webinar. You certainly leave us with very important thoughts. Basically, in the next few years, the world will experience many changes. And all of this will certainly have an important impact on Mexico and the way we deal with our own regional reality. North America is no longer, the region it used to be. And Trump certainly promises to be an entirely new sort of American president. The question is, what sort of president? And more importantly for Mexico, what does it mean for Mexico and what are we going to do about it? On behalf of all of the members of COMEXI and of me particularly, I thank you very, very much for your time and for your insights. And I hope to see you soon. Thank you, Alan.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Mariana.